So why do people even bother playing Silco in the first place? Recently, there's been a little bit of a resurgence in playing Dominators. A lot more people are playing towards Dominators. Maybe they have a spot where they think that they can play around Silco, and they end up playing Silco a little bit more often than previous patches. Dominators got a little bit of a buff, but nothing super crazy. Just a little bit of extra health on the shields. But in general, it's going to become a lot more popular to play around Dominators this patch, and we're going to talk a little bit about it, as well as lean this guide into a guide that I'm going to work on tomorrow, talking about playing for placements and how to max cap your board. But before we go into all of that, and we talk about the Dominator trait, please make sure to like and subscribe. It does help me out as a small content creator. I do daily TFT content, so I'm either going to do guides or VOD reviews, or reviews of patches, or reactions to other TFT related content that might be out there. Additionally, I also do art, so if anybody wants to check out my art store, I recently got posted, shop.fenrir's art. This is a Ukiyo-e style Jinx and Caitlyn piece that is available. There's going to be a lot more art coming up, as well as art streams in the future if you're interested in those, because I'm going to be working on a display for a convention, because that's what I used to do before I played a bunch of TFT. So this year I'm going to do another display at one of the anime conventions that I normally go to. But back to why we're actually here on this video, and let's talk a little bit about Dominators. Now, brief overview of the Dominator trait. I did make a guide on Dominators, which I will put in the little information above right about now, so you can check out that Dominator guide that was from a few months ago. But in general, Dominator, the way that it works is when Dominators cast, they gain stacking ability power based on how much mana they spend. So essentially, when you're trying to build around Dominators, you want them to kind of cast as many times as possible, and then in casting a bunch, they slowly ramp up AP, and then they become very strong. So recently, Silco is starting to get a little bit of a resurgence. In the past, because you have Cassiopeia, that is a Dominator and a Black Rose unit, the go-to way to play Dominators in previous patches was always to play a 4 Dominator Black Rose setup. So you just take your Black Rose units, and this was very strong and very meta for much of the game, and it capped very high because it leaned itself into a lot of legendary units playing around the flexible Black Rose trait. This was a common board that existed. If you're new to the game, like as of the most recent patches, it might not look that good of a board, but this used to be the board of terror for everybody that played the game. This was like one of the most meta comps in the first couple patches of the set, and since then Dominators have been a little bit power crept, and the main reason that the Dominators have been power crept is just because of the way Dominators works in general. If you read the Dominator trait, it's when they cast, they gain stacking ability power. If you do the math, you can try and do the math a little bit, but it takes time for these units to actually make use of the Dominator trait. A lot of times they need to cast multiple times in order to become comparable to other units, namely, if I were to open this up again, Sorks. Sorks is the go-to AP line. Whenever you think about AP units, you're thinking about units that need rods or use ability power as their main source of damage. But if you think about sorcerers around Zoe and LeBlanc, sorcerers just gain a lot of upfront AP in the first place. So while Dominators usually need to scale up your AP, sorcerers became really meta because of buffs to Zoe and LeBlanc, such that now sorcerers is like a go-to AP line that is typical that people play around. Additionally, having the upfront AP makes it more of an explosive comp, where the comp basically does a bunch of burst damage and basically just like deletes boards on stage 4, which is how it finds its stability. So when you think about Black Rose and you're thinking about Dominators with Black Rose, it's not necessarily the go-to option, right? If you look at Silco and you look at other Dominator units, they're often going to have lower averages. Now, Silco obviously is skewed because Chem Baron, don't look at the numbers just like as like, aha, this is a bad unit or this is a good unit. It's more so like there's other things involved with the numbers, but typically Silco is one of the lesser played, right? The first number is the play rate, one of the lesser played and lesser performing units that exist, but it is becoming a lot more than previous patches, which is something that's a little bit interesting. I'm sure if you watch many streamers, you'll see them starting to play some Black Rose Dominators in some of their boards. And the main reason is because of this unit right here, Mordekaiser. No matter what your board is, Mordekaiser is kind of broken. Mordekaiser is one of the best units in the game, and the thing about Mordekaiser that's really great is the fact that his traits really don't matter that much, so it's very easy to fit him into many different AP boards. If you think about Mordekaiser in general, a lot of times the max cap version of sorcerers involves playing a Mordekaiser late game, because he could just make great use of just being on your board as a frontline unit that can do a lot of damage. Additionally, on Dominators, this is the main chase unit that you're going for. The Dominator board itself also leans itself very heavily into 5 costs. So a lot of the time when you would play Dominators in the past, you would always cap out around LeBlanc. A lot of times you could cap out around Jace, in the fact that you have Form Swapper with the Elise, and you could also cap out around the Mordekaiser before. So when you think about Dominators, the main reason that people are starting to play it a little bit more is just the idea of placements, as well as the fact that Sorcerers is so contested, right? If we think about all the AP units, let's think about our 4-cost AP units, right? You have Zoe, you have Silco, and you have Heimerdinger. Now, Zoe is by far the most popular unit to play just because Sorks is so strong. So a lot of times when you have AP items, when I'm saying AP items, I mean like rod items or like tier items, right? If you're trying to build towards like an AP caster, a lot of times Zoe is the go-to option. The other option that's becoming a little bit more popular is playing around Heimerdinger with Academy. This one's becoming a lot more popular because of Heimerdinger buffs and just the general Academy board just being a very easy, flexible option. And the odd one out is usually Silco. Now, Silco is starting to get a lot more play. The reason is that Heimerdinger really requires you to have a certain spot as well as good Academy items, I feel, in order for it to work out really well. So what ends up happening a lot of times is that if you're in a lobby, depending on the type of lobby that you're in, a lot of times it's hard to play AP. That's the main reason why people are playing Silco. It's not because Silco is really good. And I'm sure most people, if you're watching this, you're probably like, yeah, of course Silco is bad. And yeah, of course people don't play Silco. But the problem is that if you're playing around Zoe, you might not find a Zoe. A lot of times you're thinking about your stability. You're thinking about your points of stabilization, right? If you think about Zoe, a lot of times, like, you know, something like a Lowy is very contested. That's a unit that you usually try and stabilize your front line around. The Sork board is heavily reliant on finding Elise as well as Swain upgrades because you don't really have that much front line with the Sork board. So it's very hard to stabilize with Sorks, especially if you don't have a LeBlanc. So a lot of times if you're contested, you can fizzle out very hard with the Sork board. If there's lots of people that are playing AP, and there's lots of people that are playing towards like Visionary, a lot of times with Renata reroll, they pick up Heimers as well, so it's hard to just default towards a Heimer with an AP line. What ends up happening is that Silco becomes uncontested. And Silco being uncontested, this isn't a comp you necessarily want to play contested, it's a comp where you're trying to fast 9. You're trying, not necessarily fast 9, but you're trying to stabilize really fast around units that are not sought after in order to cap out your board around the legendary units. If you think about the stats on units, right, it doesn't really matter how many Dominator you have with Mordekaiser, but the idea of having a Mordekaiser, let's say you have a Mordekaiser 2, it doesn't matter what your board is, the average for this unit is insane because of how strong it is, right? And depending on like Dominators as well, it doesn't even matter what Dominators you have in. A lot of times, like, the idea of just having a Mordekaiser is just so powerful. And the same thing applies with like a LeBlanc, and the same thing applies with like a Jace. Basically, the more of these 5 costs that you have that are upgraded, the more you can stabilize and hit like really high caps of your board to a point where the rest of the units often don't even matter. And the idea with Dominators is that if you're in a spot where you have gold and you have HP to work with, a lot of times people would rather prefer to have a board that looks like this, where you have Garen 2, Mundo 2, Silco 2, as opposed to a board where you end up with, oh, excuse me, I'm going to go back to Team Builder, a board where you have something that looks like this, Elise 1, Zoe 1, or sorry, LeBlanc 1, Zoe 1, right? If we're thinking about the core of each of these boards, Garen is not very contested despite being a very strong and reliable frontline unit to play around, and Mundo is really never really bought unless somebody is playing Twitch in your lobby. So a lot of times, if nobody's playing Twitch, you know for sure you can hit Mundo. If nobody's playing Garen or Watchers, a lot of times they're not going to be playing around the Garen, so it's going to be easy to find a Garen. And sure as hell, nobody's buying Silco. Having this form of stability makes it so that if you can roll very effectively, right, that you can hit these units, either one of these two upgrade as a front line and Silco upgrade a back line, that's typically considered to be pretty high roll by the standards of rolling on level 8 odds. A lot of times on level 8, you're usually happy with just hitting a board that looks something like this. So if you're well enough ahead and you have good items for the comp, Black Rose is a very cheap board to make, right, because all of these are low cost units. So you get additional frontline, additional stability that you can actually end up playing around Silco. And so long as other people's in the lobby's damage isn't super high, a lot of times you're very stable, right? The main thing about Dominators is that, like we were saying before, Dominators requires you to scale into the fight to actually realize the effective AP. If you're up against a board that looks something like this, where there's like a Zoe 2 or a LeBlanc 2, right? Their upfront AP is probably going to kill your Silco before you even get a chance to scale up with the Dominator trait. And that's why this board falls very flat by today's standards. And that's why, like, you know, it needs some sort of buff or rework or something like that. Like, a lot of people are asking for different changes to it because it's very awkward to play around unless you're like in a lead up in a spot where you're ahead, or like, you know, you have upgrades, right? But if you're going up against boards that don't have upgrades, right, that's where this board really shines. And that's where you should look for the Silco Dominator board. If you see people are contesting comps, even if they're not contesting sorcs, if they're contesting all the same comps that you think that you can hit a Silco very easily, the main idea that you're trying to do when you're playing around Dominators nowadays, or at least on the current patch, is hit your frontline upgrade, hit your Silco upgrade, and then use this to tempo yourself to a point where you can use a lot of gold to roll for Mordekaiser. Rolling for Mordekaiser 2 especially, or even rolling for any 5 cost, right? Playing this board with a Jace is really powerful. You can play this board with a Malzahar, which is very powerful, right? Because, you know, if you look at Dominator units, like, let's just remove some extra sauce, right? Let's just take these, right? If you're looking at this board, right, you can play a Jace 2 pretty easily because you can play it around the Elise. You can even play a Malzahar pretty easily because you can get Visionary in. And you can also just play around Blitzcrank to get Automata in for free. A lot of times you are playing Blitzcrank over the Mundo just because it's a little bit easier to have it from earlier on that you can use your gold to tempo. But it's very easy to fit in boards where you can play around multiple different legendaries. What that means is that it gives you a lot of opportunity to spike this board on level 9. So when people are playing around Silco, you're not playing Silco from behind. You're not playing Silco like when you're in dire straits, when you don't have a lot of HP. What you're trying to do is you're trying to use this as a stepping stone to actually play the better units a little bit later, because you're able to hit these units relatively uncontested, relatively easily. And that's like the idea of, like, you know, understanding lobby tempo, which we made a guide about, as well as understanding like whether your spot is really strong where you could play for a first or you should play for a placement. A lot of times Silco boards, I've seen multiple top level players as well as like masters level players, like different people that I watch, they often win lobbies playing around Silco, and they're not winning the lobby off of the Silco having a good spot. They're winning a lobby off of everybody else contesting a similar board and you hitting Mordekaiser 2, Jace 2, Malzahar 2, some rendition of these units, LeBlanc 2 as well, but usually LeBlanc's hard to hit. But as soon as you hit a couple 5-star 2-stars, you automatically put yourself in a spot where you're extremely strong relative to the rest of the lobby. Now, what is a good Silco spot? Where can you actually do this? You have to be ahead, right? That's the first thing, right? So, what I'll put needs, right? So what do you need? Oops, it's a little bit cut off. Let me draw it a little bit more centered. So, needs. You need to be ahead. And you need to have good Dom items. And this is the idea of what you're trying to do. It works the same with many other comps, but the idea is that if you have like really strong items for Silco, typically Shojin Nashers is what helps him to cast a bunch. Shojin Nashers, and then maybe like a Jewel Gauntlet. If you have a bunch of attack speed by other means, like for example like a Zeke's Herald or something else, then a lot of times you can drop some of the attack speed and you can play more into like crit or damage amp. You're gonna get a lot of AP enemies with the Dominator build, so you can then like, you know, transfer that AP into a large amount of damage by giving yourself a lot of crit chance or a lot of damage amp. Typically on Garen, you want to have at least one major belt item or as many belt items as possible, because he puts it onto different units. And then Mordekaiser, all that matters is when Mordekaiser casts that he pops off and he does as much damage as possible. So you have a 10-second window to get in as many auto attacks as possible. So what does that mean? You want to have QSS usually. Uninterrupted autos and a bunch of attack speed that happens early in the fight. So he gets his QSS, he gets uninterrupted, massive amounts of damage pumping out. Additionally, a lot of people put Nashers on him because once he starts his damage cycle, that procs Nashers instantly because it's his first ability cast. And then the last item is usually some sort of damage item that can convert some of his damage into either crit chance or more power. So a lot of times you'll see something like a Jewel Gauntlet, or you'll see something like a Guard Breaker, damage amp, or you'll give something like even a Rabadon sometimes is good, just because it helps him out a little bit in terms of like damage amp just being a giga item. But usually you're going for some rendition of these builds. Now, something that's really important to understand is that Mordekaiser doesn't really care too much about Conquer. It doesn't really care too much about Dominator. So that's like the main idea here. So even though you're playing around Dominators, a lot of times you can play other comps and still do a similar strategy to play around Mordekaiser. But I'm just saying why this strategy works is because nobody's really ever going to contest Silco. But you can actually do this with many different boards. A lot of times, right? A lot of times, the max cap of other boards is with a Mordekaiser as well. I'll give you another example, right? Another less played unit that isn't very popular is Twitch right now. Twitch, for a similar reason as Dominators, doesn't really fit into the meta, or quote-unquote meta. I say meta, but what I just mean is like the way things are balanced right now, a lot more explosive damage is the thing that is really strong. Like, unless you're playing reroll, you don't have the ability to tank through some of the damage. Think Sorks, right? Sorks is one of the best comps in the game right now. They have a lot of upfront AP. They delete your board instantly. It's not a board that lasts for, like, you know, overtime fights. So stuff like Twitch, where you want to ramp up with the Gwinsu, has a similar problem as Dominators. But you'll often see if people are ahead and they're uncontested, they have certain enabling augments, like a experiment spat, right? Where you're ahead early, right? A similar idea happens, right? You play a board like this. Let me just put on all the units, right? Experiment. Bop, bop, bop. Right? This. Give me a sniper like Caitlyn, sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Vi. Yeah, sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Whatever. This is your board, right? Let's say this is your board, and you have an early experiment emblem. Experiment emblem is really strong early game because it gives you duplicates of units if you use that as your experiment bonus. So a lot of times you're able to tempo into a comp like this. It's a similar idea as what I was saying with Silco and why people play Silco now. It's not because Twitch is like the broken forecast and it's the best comp in the game. The idea is that you're using it with a lot of early HP advantage, as well as like general strength in being able to play a comp that less people are buying the units and relying on certain units. You can stabilize really heavily around 2-starring some of these less popular units. Maybe Vi's a little bit more popular, but you understand what I mean. By stabilizing around these units, you'll notice that with this comp, a lot of times the max cap version of this also includes Mordekaiser, right? And it's not because he's like a Dominator or any, like, yes, he has the Dominator synergy with Mundo, so Mordekaiser fits in really nicely, but a lot of times the idea is just to stack your board with many 5 costs. If you have a comp that has a lot of open space on it, right, there's a lot of emptiness where you can fit in multiple units, either by playing like, you know, Black Rose, where you have a really cheap, stable front line in the form of an extra Scion unit that helps you to tank some damage, or if you're playing a comp like this with Twitch Mundo, where a lot of the synergies don't really matter beyond having like experiment and bonuses on your certain particular units. You can just fit in a bunch of free 5 costs, right? And the more 5 costs that you have, this is how you make these boards cap out very high. And this is something I talked about a little bit when talking about 4 costs and how to cap boards. We're going to do 2 guides after this one, but I want to do this as an intro, which is just basically talking about, like, you know, playing uncontested, finding boards that can work in order to tempo, and why certain boards that, even though they're very weak, you might see some of your favorite streamers or favorite players playing the game, right? I remember yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, I think Soju busted out Silco games like multiple times on his stream, and he got first in almost all of them. Like, I think he went first, second, and then one of them he trolled and he went bot for. You know how it is, like typical, like, you know, streamers doing their streamer things. But it's just to give you an idea that, you know, these comps aren't necessarily the strongest comps, but a lot of the games where he's going first or second, as well as games that I play like this, or anybody else, you can be in gold or bronze or iron, the idea remains the same. 5 cost upgrades are massive. A lot of times this Twitch board is useless, and then if you have a Caitlyn 2, all of a sudden it's extremely strong. Playing around 5 cost that can just slot into your board, as well as being able to level and maybe fit in a 6 cost, or playing around some of the 6 costs as well, gives you so much power that it often doesn't matter how weak your board is according to stats. It matters more that you reach your high cap. And you'll notice that happens a lot, right? If you go on Explorer and you go like Silco, and you go Silco 2-star, the average is very mid. It's like a top 4 or 50-50. It's not that strong. And you'll see that a lot of the times, the traits and the units that are played with it, it's mostly like, you know, Chem Baron cash outs that kind of skews it a little bit upwards. So you can assume that it's going to be a little bit lower if you don't have something like a Manazane, which is a Giga enabler broken item for Silco, or if you don't have like certain builds where you're using like emblems or what's it called, Baron cash outs, that it'll be a little bit lower than average. It's not the best comp. But as soon as you have a Mordekaiser, right, it all of a sudden just becomes a broken comp. If you add a Mordekaiser and you add like a Jace, it starts to climb even higher. And if you eventually ever hit like a Mordekaiser 2, you'll see that it spikes really high. And that's the same thing that happens with a lot of different comps. Like pretty much any comp that you plug in, if you just put a Mordekaiser 2 out of nowhere, it becomes very powerful. So that's like the main idea that I want to introduce today. Is just the idea of like with some uncontested comps, how you can like cap out your board extremely high and play for like this, right? So Silco went from being a very consistent comp playing around Dominator Black Rose, right? Well, we'll just re-put it in while I speak, right? It used to be a very consistent comp where you basically play Dominator Black Rose and you either play 4 or 6 Dominator. Usually you only play 6 Dominator if you hit a Dominator emblem because it's a little bit clumpersome to fit in. But this used to be a very consistent and reliable comp where you're kind of just playing for like a 4th or like a top 4 because you were pretty stable and safe with this type of comp. But now it turned into a very 1st or 8th style comp, right? Silco on his own and Dominators on its own is very weak, but if you're able to cap very high, so if you're in a spot, like let's say you're playing in a Galaxy or an encounter where like you have a bunch of gold, like gold sub, or you're playing an encounter where you have a bunch of loot that allows you to level very easily. Certain encounters can really enable you to push levels and make it to level 9 very fast. And being able to roll and play around all upgraded 5 costs is very powerful. But the main reason that Silco is played is because of how uncontested it is. For what it's worth, it's not that bad, it's just hard to cap. If you are in a spot where you can hit your units for free and then make it to level 9 to play around as many 5 costs as you can find to upgrade, you're in a good spot and you're usually playing for first. And that's like the idea, is that you only really want to play towards Silco if you're going towards more of a 1st or 8th strategy. You're not playing Silco for the consistency that you get a top 4. You're playing it because you're saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to hit all these units and then I can cap out really high. You can still play for a 4th, of course. You can still play for like a middle like placement. But a lot of times what you're looking at is you're saying, okay, in this lobby, a lot of people are contesting the better comps and a lot of people are contesting the 4 costs. So if I'm going to play a weaker comp, what I need to do is I need to make sure that I'm 1, uncontested on the weaker comp, and 2, have the ability to then push a level afterwards to spike this weaker comp in a way that makes it competitive with these stronger comps, right? It doesn't matter if somebody has Zoe 2, 6 Sorc, and everything upgraded, if you have a Mordekaiser 2 and they don't have a LeBlanc 2, because the Mordekaiser 2 is just going to be way more valuable and do so much more damage in a lot of these cases. So that's a little intro guide for today. Hopefully it was somewhat informative. I want to make it a little bit chill, as well as a little bit shorter, and just talk a little bit about like this idea to introduce it. I want to segue it into tomorrow's video, which I'm working on right now, which is going to be talking about playing for placements. And that one's going to be with the PowerPoint. It's going to be all nice. So a little bit of a break day. Obviously, it's been a little bit of a stressful last couple days. Also, I had to reset my computer today. If you guys came into stream today, my stream deleted itself. I couldn't stream TFT and play at the same time, so I have to reinstall a bunch of programs. But either way, regardless of that, hopefully this was somewhat informative and it gives you a little bit of an idea. It's kind of obvious to some people, but of course if it wasn't obvious, that's why I want to make the guide. But it's just the idea of like, hey, you can play around Silco in certain spots and then play around Dominators. If you want more information about Dominators, I do have the link to the Dominator guide, which I didn't want to step on those toes too much and talk about different variations, but that's an idea that you can play around as well. Thank you for watching and have a great day, and see ya. Bye-bye.